Slig Storm was a game idea pitched by Oddworld Inhabitants lead game designer Paul O'Connor shortly after the release of 1998's Oddworld Abe's Exoddus, that would have had a Slig as the main character. The idea didn't get much past the pitching stage, despite Lorne Lanning liking the concept and talking to certain parties about the potential of bringing it to fruition. Despite not getting very far at all, Slig Storm has developed a somewhat legendary status within the Oddworld fandom since it was first mentioned, and the mythology of it has continuously endured. O'Connor introduced Slig Storm in posts on the Oddworld Yahoo group in 2000, saying, "You know, we have a programmer here who is convinced the Sligs are the good guys, and I did once pitch a bonus game called Slig Storm. Didn't happen, but you never know. Was going to be a brief game where you played an outcast albino Slig grub that needed to blast its way out of a Slig birthing complex." Now, my interpretation of this has always been that in the Oddworld world, wait, that sounds weird. In the Oddworld universe, or at least its industrial world, eugenics is common, and as a result, living beings born with mutations are killed at birth for being considered defective, exterminated for what the society views as compassionate reasons. However, this interpretation might be wrong, as I've also heard other versions where he's allowed to exist, but because he's different, he's outcasted, which would likely lead to him being killed by his brethren in this deadly, unforgiving world. This theory kind of makes sense to me because why would the industrialists lose labour or workers if they're able to work, and is kind of backed up in an edition of Dear Alf, where Krigg the Slig was asked, "Do you know the albino Slig from Slig Storm?" To which he replied, "I don't associate with any weirdo Sligs, albino or otherwise." At the same time though, considering O'Connor said the albino is a Slig grub that needs to escape a birthing complex, well, that suggests to me that he would have been killed at birth. So I think I'm gonna continue thinking my original take on Slig Storm, but I'm just pointing out that we haven't been given the concept in too much detail, so it's open to interpretation, I guess. The main character of Slig Storm would have been, as stated, a Slig who's born an albino, which in the real world is a person or animal that has a congenital absence of pigment in their skin and hair, which causes them to be white and extremely pale, as well as usually causing their eyes to be pink. Presumably in Oddworld this would be the case for the Slig Storm Slig as well, with many interpreting the albino Slig as basically looking like an ordinary Slig except with white or just pale skin. That being said, the fact that O'Connor describes the character specifically as a Slig grub suggests I'd imagine that it'd potentially look quite a bit different from the standard fully grown Sligs that we're used to, and instead is maybe reminiscent in appearance to an insect larva of some kind perhaps. Literally the definition of larvae is the active immature form of an insect, especially one that differs greatly from the adult and forms the stage between egg and pupa, e.g. a caterpillar or grub, which would kind of make sense maybe, considering Sligs apparently evolved from slug-like creatures. Really the only references we have to go by as far as I'm aware would be these pieces of concept art of baby Sligs, and I think the pale skin colour with red eyes actually really suits the image of a Slig. How exactly a Slig larva would have the capability to presumably take up arms and fight its way out to get to freedom, or even be aware that it would need to do this, who knows? Although, that being said, Sligs are born with extensive capabilities immediately, seemingly, as Sligs are forced to escape from their mother, their queen Skillia, as soon as she gives birth to them, as if she catches any newly born Sligs, she eats them out of hatred due to the painful birthing process. It consequently makes sense that a race that is immediately born with a sense of danger and of needing to escape for their survival would have the ability to continue doing this after avoiding getting eaten, when they realise that they're different and are still in danger. The gameplay of Slig Storm is something I've always wondered about, how that'd work exactly. Would it be a shooter? For some reason I've always imagined the Slig grub as basically being like one of the crawling Sligs from Abe's Exoddus. However, this wouldn't make much sense, as these fully formed adult Sligs are shown as not being able to defend themselves or carry guns, which the albino presumably would do, judging by Paul O'Connor saying it would need to blast its way out of the birthing complex. O'Connor spoke more about the game itself, saying Slig Storm would have been something like 50 to 100 screens, maybe the size of the Slig barracks from Exoddus, give or take. We would have built the game using the Exoddus engine with a few enhancements, probably no infinite lives for example, maybe a couple minutes of story to tie it together. I suppose those 2 minutes of full motion video cutscenes, as it's typically described, would have portrayed the albino's birth and subsequent escape from the facility. Actually, it kind of reminds me of the opening scene of Ratchet and Clank. And at the end, presumably there'd be a scene of the albino making his way to freedom, I suppose. O'Connor also explained about why he pitched the game, explaining, "The idea was to package Abe's Oddysee and Exoddus in a promotional box, and include a bonus CD with some making of features and the Slig Storm bonus game. To be honest, this sounds like a really good idea, and almost an obvious idea, with or without the bonus game, to repackage Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exoddus together on the PlayStation 1. It surprises me that they didn't do that, as far as I'm aware. The games are so similar, it just kind of makes sense to put them together at some stage. Paul's pitch to add a small bonus game to it too is really fantastic, and it's really a great shame that this didn't end up happening. The story of it sounds so very Oddworld, and would have fitted in perfectly as just a small bonus game. The fact it's such a good story is likely the reason it's still brought up nowadays, and is, in my opinion, probably the most iconic of the unreleased Oddworld games, which is pretty incredible considering this is one that, unlike others such as Fenger's Clot or Squeak's Oddysee, was never planned, and was basically literally just an idea, despite many people thinking the game was in active development at some point. Paul O'Connor himself said, "Slig Storm is vapor. It's a title I made up when pitching a bonus game for a proposed Abe's Oddysee, Abe's Exoddus Omnibus re-release for Sony PlayStation." Staff on the official Oddworld Discord in 2017 also said Slig Storm was never really more than an idea. It was cancelled pretty early on. The reason for why Slig Storm didn't happen at the time was for a couple of reasons. O'Connor stated in 2000 that the reason to do that particular game closed about a year ago, as we're now firmly committed to PS2. As the Oddworld Inhabitants team had switched over from the Alive game engine used for Exoddus by that point, which apparently was in general a difficult engine to use anyway, it's understandable that it would have been difficult to then go back to it to make Slig Storm, with him later saying, "But like I said, that window has closed. We're on to PS2 development now, and I'm not sure we could even revert to the old engine if we wanted to. It's kind of like asking NASA to rev up a Saturn V for a return trip to the moon. It's old technology, and our infrastructure no longer supports it." Similarly, a 2013 article by Retro Gamer said Slig Storm didn't happen mainly due to working on Munch's Oddysee, and another similar article a year later by them expanded on this, saying there had been discussions over a 2D platform game called Slig Storm, but this was axed due to the demand for 3D. However, Lorne Lanning spoke about why Slig Storm didn't happen in one of the Oddworld Discord Oddworld Q&As in 2022. He was asked if Oddworld Inhabitants had ever considered doing a game with a Slig as the main character, to which he replied, "We wanted to, you know, and there's kind of a lesson that I'd learnt from it. We wanted to, and we were talking to, you know, parties about it. And some feedback was coming back and was like, why do you want to sell less games? I was like, what? They go, look at these guys, they don't have expressions, they don't have, you know, they started going into the deficit. So if I put Sligs on a movie poster, you know, without a charming Abe or something like that, that's why I was thinking of Slig Storm, because I thought that was cool, but I think a lot of the feedback was it would largely have the possibility of selling within the known community of people that would like that kind of experience over an Abe experience, and that was kind of the summary. I'm not saying that was my conclusion, but I had to face it, you know? I had to say, I love the idea, but you know, I love creepy, weird, really weird stuff, you know? And a lot of us did, so that just became a barrier where we're like, maybe that wouldn't work as well. I'm sure it would have like a really strong cult following, you know, but I don't know how well it could sell. And that makes a lot of difference if you're trying to raise the money for properties, and I thought this one might just be too much of an uphill battle against, you know, marketing teams' perceptions and things like that. And maybe they're right, you know, I can't say I know for sure. I love the idea, I don't know how commercially viable, and when you're raising this much money to do these things, you can't ignore that variable, especially if it's coming from feedback from the people who need to sell it for you. And this is generally the explanation given as to why the game didn't happen. The publishers felt like Sligs were too ugly to be the hero of the game, and as a result didn't think it would sell well. Wait, Sligs don't look good enough to be commercially marketable? Ah jeez, I better visit a Vicar for some plastic surgery. Despite this, the idea of Slig Storm kept in the minds of the fandom, and I suspect this is what kept it on Oddworld Inhabitants' radar too, with Alf saying in 2000 in the third Dear Alf, Slig Storm was briefly considered as a PlayStation game, but publishing plans are always in flux, and we elected not to pursue that particular project. The Slig Storm concept remains on our drawing boards and may see the light of day, and sooner than you expect. Of course, that's never happened, so who knows what the heck Alf was on about there. Think he was eating those funny mushrooms again. However, when Oddworld came back and made the partnership with Just Add Water, it seemed that many old titles, including Slig Storm, would potentially finally get made, with Oddworld Inhabitants themselves in July 2011 seeming to indicate that they were going to be working on it. The next month, however, Alf seemed to give a more subdued, albeit still somewhat optimistic response, saying, Slig Storm is one of those ideas we had that didn't get far, but it's still in our one-day drawer. The frequently asked questions page on the Oddworld Inhabitants website even said, question, will there ever be new Oddworld games? Answer, yes, looking into the future we hope to return to other unreleased projects, brackets, Slig Storm and the Brutal Ballad of Fangus Clot, brackets, including the long-awaited continuation of the Oddworld quintology with Squeak's Oddysee. It is far too early to start talking about these or any other future plans. Despite this, Lorne Lanning himself never seemed to deviate from the reason it didn't get made in the first place, saying in the December 2012 Reddit Q&A, a big question is how will people react to a hero that is a Slig? Sligs ain't so pretty, I mean, they even make Abe looks handsome. So this is a curious challenge, and would like to get feedback into the idea of a Slig as a hero in a game. Well, it's actually an albino Slig. However, during the partnership between Oddworld Inhabitants and Just Add Water, Stuart Gilray, the head of the latter, would end up talking about Slig Storm, giving quite a different take on the game, explaining, "There's an albino Slig. He's discovered he's one of a kind. He gets picked on by other Sligs to the point he goes fuck you and starts shooting them all. But it's based in Rupture Farms. So the idea is you're playing this albino Slig, trying to help the Mudokons escape to some degree by killing all the Sligs, almost like an Inside Man route." This is a relatively wildly different take on the traditional telling of the story, and what's interesting to consider is whether this was Stuart Gilray misremembering the concept of Slig Storm somewhat, or if by that point Just Add Water were looking into trying to get it made, and this was now what the game was going to be about, which is very possible, as it's known that they had considered making Slig Storm as downloadable content for 2014's Abe's Oddysee remake Oddworld New and Tasty. Considering Gilray specifically says it's based in Rupture Farms, and naturally New and Tasty was also based in Rupture Farms, maybe that's why he said that. Perhaps they were planning to tie in Slig Storm as DLC for New and Tasty by setting it in the same place. I guess you could maybe say there's evidence to suggest this, but nothing concrete, it's more circumstantial. Although Just Add Water never did end up doing this, they did create DLC for New and Tasty, the Alf's Escape bonus level, where when you arrive at Alf's Brew Bar in Rupture Farms, sitting drunkenly at the table sipping Soulstorm brew is a very pale-skinned Slig. Although the bright white lights are there to potentially add ambiguity to whether this Slig actually is pale or whether it's just the lights, Stuart Gilray practically confirmed, or at least heavily hinted, that it is the albino Slig from Slig Storm. So in some ways they did have Slig Storm DLC, I guess, which was a nice little, well, quite big Easter egg. Another potential interesting thing is that Stuart said while he was talking about Slig Storm, I can't remember the character name. Now, I'm mentioning this as potentially suggesting there may have been a name for the albino Slig that he can't remember, but maybe that's not the case. I'm probably just extrapolating too much from that, I just thought it was interesting. The cameo in Alf's Escape is testament to the legacy of Slig Storm, that a game that was literally just an idea from the late 90s that was briefly considered and never went that far was still so important to the fandom that it was referenced in DLC around 16 years later. Despite this, Slig Storm is unlikely to ever be made by Oddworld Inhabitants. In the "What game would you like to see after New and Tasty" poll they did in January 2013, Slig Storm came second to last, with 3% of the vote, or 473 votes. In my opinion, I think this is mainly due to just there being other options that people wanted to see more. There's been so many unreleased Oddworld titles, and I think this is why I suppose the chances of Slig Storm getting made were incredibly slim in the first place, as it's sort of buried under other games that didn't get made either. Oddworld Inhabitants' original focus was just on the main 5 games of the Oddworld Quintology series, most of which didn't get made, and then also had plans to do bonus titles in between the Quintology games, and again, most of them didn't get made either. For example, Paul O'Connor was asked in 2000, "Will we still see Slig Larvae and the Slig Nursery Complex?" To which he replied, "Not in Munch's Oddysee, maybe Munch's Exoddus." Another game that didn't get made. The layers are so deep. Really, I guess the idea that Slig Storm, a small title that was just pitched by a developer at the company, was going to be an exception and actually make it to being released by Oddworld Inhabitants is kind of ludicrous in some ways, arguably. There was never any serious prospect of Slig Storm getting developed by them right off the bat when the idea was revealed to the public. It was, as O'Connor said, nothing but vapor. but it certainly has a legendary status, and I think it's a testament to how good an idea it is that the Oddworld fandom sort of latched onto and still has never let go of Slig Storm.
Hello, follow me.